welcome everybody that's attending the presentation right now. We really appreciate you coming. Amala is a consulting group that does work with the SBDC, and they've graciously agreed to work with us and provide a presentation on transitioning from phase 1 to phase 2. With that, I'm going to let Jaren take over, and if you have any questions, feel free to jump in.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
No
We
problem.
have today Jaren Cuppers and myself, Sarah Parks. We also have another consultant who's not here with us today, but the three of us have been working on SBIR, STTR, and other types of federal, state foundation grants for a while now, and have other types of work that we do. In terms of how we're going to go about today, we sort of have three sessions, so we're going to hold 3 sections. So we're going to hold questions to the end of each section, although I guess you could type them in if you have them along the way.
Yep, feel free to throw them in the questions box or the chat box at any time.
Yeah, and so we'll answer any questions at the end of each section. And go next. Okay. So what you'll be learning today is just a basic general overview, of course, of the SBIR STTR Phase 2 program, the award phases, eligibility criteria. We're going to give you insights into how to plan and write the proposal, mistakes to avoid, how to develop a submission strategy, and just really build a strong proposal overall. And one of the most important things, developing a solid budget and surviving the financial audit, which will go into a lot of detail. Also going into creating a strong commercialization plan, which of course for phase 2 is a lot more emphasized. And we're going to talk very briefly about how you can utilize the funding to work with our company, Amala Consulting and SBDC, to receive assistance. So again, sort of the sections that we're going to go through, we're going to do a quick introductions just so we know, what programs people are going to be applying to, what agencies different people are going to be applying to, and just sort of your name and a brief intro to your technology. We're going to have phase 2 basics, and then building a strong proposal, budget, financial audit, commercialization, and finally working with Amala Consulting. Not knowing which agencies everyone's applying for, we've mainly focused on NSF, NIH, and DoD because those are the 3 biggest that we generally have people applying to. So we'll be answering a lot of questions about those. So on to phase 2 basics. The success rates vary and are much higher than that of phase 1, which is good news for everyone. For DoD, 67%, and then in the 40% range for NIH, NSF, NASA, DOE. And one of the main reasons people are not successful is because they don't survive the financial audit. So we'll be talking a lot about that.
And just really quickly, really your chance of DoD is about the same as the other agencies. That's pretty biased by the large SBIR job shops, especially those based out of California that essentially are just think tanks for DoD. So it's a pretty good chance though, 40 to 50%.
So for NIH, I mean, hopefully everyone is aware of this already, but it's an important note if you're not. If you have to maintain eligibility, we're presuming that everyone has received phase 1 that is on this call, but that might not be the case. But if you're a phase 1 awardee, you need to submit to a phase 2 application within the first 6 due dates following the expiration of your phase 1 budget period. So, and you can either submit before or after the expiration of that phase 1 budget period. And if you're initially rejected under NIH, you are allowed to resubmit a phase 2 application. For NSF, phase 2 proposals have fixed submission dates, roughly 8, 14, or 20 months after the effective date of your phase 1 award. And so you're going to look at your phase 1 award letter to confirm the exact date. But if you're rejected for an NSF, you are not allowed to resubmit a phase 2 application.
And DoD is a lot more fluid than the other agencies. They often get caught up in their own paperwork, so that's going to be very program specific, agency specific within DoD.
And different agencies for the phase 2 proposal stress different types of things. So you can see across NIH, NSF, DoD, and NASA, phase 1 results are, of course, pretty important. The phase 2 work plan is less important for NSF, but pretty important for the others. Commercialization plan is still not as emphasized in the NIH, but more emphasized in the others. And then team is, you just want to have a strong team, but if you've done your phase 1 work and you've received a phase 1, you probably have already passed that test.
And we'll continually talk about how commercialization is extremely stressed by the National Science Foundation. And we'll touch on it for HHS, NIH. You'll see that even in their application process, it's de-emphasized, since they're really catering towards a crowd where you may not be commercialization ready coming out of phase 2, like you would be expected to be under the other agencies. And that's going to be clinical trials and regulatory limitations that would affect that.
So amounts and funding for phase 2 NSF, it's $750,000. You've got a 2-year limit, and you can have a no cost extension of 6 months. Phase 2B.
This is a great, so NSF is really startup friendly, and they have these 2 additional add-on funding mechanisms. The TECP, I'm going to skip out of order here, but the TECP happens concurrently with the phase 2, and it adds 6 months to the phase 2 project, and they give you another $250,000, and you really get to choose what to do with that money. It's a use it or lose it situation, and it's generally, the whole point of it is to add a little something to your project for a specific customer. So maybe you're making a general device, and in your marketplace there's one major customer who wants some additional feature or capability, then you can add that add-on funding. And then the phase 2B comes after phase 2, but it is considered an extension of the phase 2. And it says, and essentially the way that works is, for every dollar you raise in either sales or investment during your phase 2, you get 50 cents in additional research dollars, up to $500,000. So if you raise $1 million, then you get a $500,000 project. There are different requirements at different funding levels. If you go above 250,000, you have to actually fly down to Virginia/DC to present to the program managers your phase 2B project. But for the most part, I think all of that kind of stuff gets green lighted. If you've gotten that far in your phase 2 and you're being successful, then you generally get that phase 2B money. And just a note on investment, if that's something you're thinking about doing, that phase 2B, you want to be very careful about what kind of investment instruments you end up taking. You cannot use debt instruments, so the traditional convertible note is not allowed, although there is something called a SAFE agreement, which essentially works identical to a note, which is not considered a debt instrument. So just be very careful about, if you're raising money, how you organize that, because you don't want to miss out on that funding opportunity. I forgot. And there's also this like huge array of other weird add-on funding that even half the program managers don't even know about. Really niche stuff, but if it applies to you, it could be, it's just free money. Like one that I am thinking of off the top of my head, for phase 2 awardees, you can partner with a community college and hire 2 employees for 6 months or a year, or sorry, not employees, students, and they give you $50,000 to do that. It's just like really random pots of money. So it's something to explore on the NSF website if you get your phase 2.
Phase 2 NIH, there's a range of funding available, $1 million to currently about 1.7 million. And the range is there because there are certain topics that are approved for budget waivers. And there's a document on the SBIR, STTR, NIH website that has a list of all those topics that would be approved. And you'll want to, of course, talk to the program manager beforehand to get that budget waiver. So again, a 2-year limit, and there are some state match funding opportunities.
If you wonder why that's a weird number, it's because NIH is now adjusting for inflation, but NSF is not. But it's unclear as to why NIH is doing that and no other agency is.
So next, we're going to go over building a strong proposal. So really the written section. So initial steps to structuring and writing, you're going to, of course, want to develop your objectives or specific aims. We're going to use different terminology because the different agencies used different terminology, but so objectives and specific aims are used for the different agencies. You want to keep these simple and, of course, feasible. And for phase 2, you'll want about 5 to 7 of them. And early on in the process, you're going to want to develop your tasks, schedule, milestone, deliverables, and align these to your budget. We run into problems working with companies all the time where they don't start their budget until, I don't know, 2 weeks before, and then they realize that they can't do all the tasks that they've written up and the different milestones, and then they have to go back and shift everything that they've written up in their research plan. So we really try to emphasize getting all of that aligned early on in the process. And you want to make sure that your activities align with the various agencies' payment schedule. So for example, NSF gives you 25% upfront, then 3 payments of 20%, at month, whatever intervals in between, and then a final payment of 15%. So you want to make sure that you're able to do the tasks that you have laid out, or that your company has the funds to be able to cover those costs until you've received payment from that agency. And then, of course, with STTR, you're going to want to communicate with the research institute, usually the university, to define their tasks and their budget early on.
And if you're doing an STTR too, we'll get, I don't know if we mentioned this later, so I'm just going to say it now. You'll want to make sure you align their payment schedule with that of the institution that's funding you. So if you're doing NSF, make sure you have a few months between when you receive payment from NSF and when you owe it to the university. That's just a little side note.
Yeah. And then you'll want to compile, you might most likely need to get additional research for your commercialization plan. And so that can often take a lot of time. You might want to reach out to different people to help you in that. So those are some things that you should be doing early on. And again, we're going to talk more about who to reach out to help with the commercialization plan. So agency-specific considerations. For NSF, you want to aim to have a commercializable product coming out of phase 2. NIH, you're going to aim to be ready for the clinical trials. And DoD, it's sometimes explicit. And then you'll want to aim to provide a component with a functional product and all the specifications. So they sometimes have like a really specific thing that they're looking for that they want you to develop. So
yeah, they generally, if you have a DoD project, you're probably already familiar. If you don't, you may not be, but they generally have like a wish list and a target list. They actually use specific DoD terminology, but it's sort of meaningless to other folks if you're not in the know. So you have to meet some minimum specification to be considered successful, and then you have these reach targets that they'd ideally like you to reach. So a lot of those projects, there's a very specific thing coming out of it that they want. The alternative is if there's more fluidity, you really want to make sure you're working with the program manager, with the unit which is going to receive the product of your phase 2 or phase 3 work, to make sure that you are actually aligning with their expectations. And sometimes you can't even rely on them to do that well. So I know a company, for example, that was working with the Navy, and the even the program manager was not properly communicating the requirements for the end of the project. So the company really had to dig deep, and then discovered what they had done during the phase 1 actually didn't really support the final product that they needed to create in the phase 2. So it can be very problematic. DoD is very disorganized. It depends on the agency, the contingent, but yeah, if you have DoD, it's going to be a lot more complicated, because you're essentially making something for I'll put it in quotes, a customer.
Onto writing your research plan. You're of course going to want to build on the previous proposals, your phase 1 strengths, and of course review any of the criticisms from phase 1 reviewers and make sure that you address it directly within your phase 2 proposal. You're going to present clear deliverables and milestones, and have a Gantt chart that outlines your timeline, and you're going to reinforce your deliverables for each objective and aim, and discuss risks and your mitigation strategies for each of those deliverables. And if you're collaborating, which most companies we work with do have some form of outside consultants, be explicit and tell who they are, what they're doing, and where they're going to do it, what facility. Make sure you convey that you have adequate access to equipments and tools necessary to complete the work, or include those items in the budget. There is a equipment and tools separate document, and a facility separate document. Usually those are separate for each agency. And you're writing to academic experts in your field, so you need to use technical, scientific terms and methods, and expect that they will know the norms and methods used for that research.
We'll talk about reviewers in more detail later. I just want to take a quick step back and remind everyone how expansive a phase 2 application is. You're generally giving somewhere in the range of 50 to 100 pages of documentation to your program manager and the reviewers. So it's really your job to make everything as digestible for them as possible, to give yourself a fighting chance. If you can, from their perspective, if you can't organize, this application into something reasonable, then it's going to shed doubt on whether you can run a company that needs to do this kind of stuff on a regular basis. So yeah, that's really what we're trying to get at here, is making all of this very digestible for the reviewers.
Yeah, and don't, 50 pages sounds like a lot, but it really is. We're going to go into it a little bit more, but there'll be 15 pages for the proposal, and some varies across, but 5 to 15 pages for commercialization plan, a page for this, page for that. But so it is broken out, and we'll go into it a little bit more again later. Oh, well, we're right on to reviewer.
As I said, we'll talk about the reviewers more. So I personally serve as an SBIR, a National Science Foundation SBIR reviewer on a regular basis, and I've had personal conversations with program managers from other agencies, so I have a rough idea of sort of what reviewers look like. And there is some published statistical information on reviewer affiliations, which is that pie chart you can see at the bottom there. And what you'll see is that most of the people that you're talking to are going to be technically trained people. So for the most part, PhDs or master's degrees with lots of industry experience. I will quickly say that the pie chart's a little bit biased by DoD, which brings in a lot more national laboratory input than the other agencies do, or national lab and government. So when you're talking about NSF or NIH, you're really talking about majority university and private sector, but a lot of it is university reviewers. So these are all going to be highly trained experts. Now, the problem is that the program managers don't necessarily have infinite access to the most relevant talent. And so you're going to have someone who might be well trained in your expertise area, say clinical biology or something like that, but they may or may not have expertise in your particular topic of study. So if you're doing a specific RNA analysis, for example, they may not know that, but they're going to know enough to know, and they'll do some background research if they need to know whether what you're proposing is legitimate or not. Especially during the phase 2 for NSF, there's the private sector participants will definitely shed more light on the validity of commercialization plans. So for NSF, that's another reason to take that whole section very seriously. And then we shouldn't forget that the program managers are often some of the most important reviewers. They can either be your biggest advocate, or they can be the one who ensures that you don't see any funding. And for most of the agencies, the program managers are also either from industry and or are technically trained. And they've read now hundreds and hundreds of these things and know which companies have been successful. So definitely, as we said earlier, you want to make sure you're you're writing your technical language for a technically competent audience, but don't assume that they're necessarily a super expert in your particular technology. And then another important thing is understanding how reviewers read. You've probably heard about how folks read journal papers and such in the past. And if you took note of your own behavior, it's probably really similar to this, which is you read a title, you probably scroll through and look at the graphics, the tables, maybe then you read the abstract, and then you sort of start jumping into the meat, which might mean reading the first paragraphs of individual sections. People don't just sit down and read a journal paper from the beginning to the end generally, unless they know it's something that they want to read, and reviewers operate the same way. So graphics have a disproportionate impact on how reviewers read and interact with each other on the panel. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to properly present that and figures and numbers and such in general. Interestingly, a good portion of the world, including those who are highly educated, are innumerate. So innumeracy is a lack of an ability to reason with numbers. So my example here is people drastically interpret the following 4 things very differently: 20 out of 100, 20%, 0.2, and 1 out of 5. Understanding the best way to present numbers is actually a skill, and you don't necessarily have the time to develop it, but it is important to understand that people do translate those differently. I won't go through the full example down here, but there have been quite a few studies on innumeracy. And one of the interesting things was they did one study, 36% of participants were college educated and another 88% were. And despite the difference in education level, they asked these 8 numeracy questions. The one example is, if the chance of getting a disease is 10%, how many people would be expected to get the disease out of 100 or out of 1,000? Believe it or not, 58% of participants in both studies answered a none or only one of those 8 questions correctly, and only 16% in the uneducated and 18% in the educated biased studies answered all the questions correctly. So you know, it's actually a considerable issue, but that just means that you need to be very careful in how you present data. We see a lot of papers where a lot of reviewers make comments that we think don't make any sense, but that's because for the most part, Sarah and I are numerate people. And a lot of the companies that we work with are also numerate, but that doesn't mean that the reviewers are. And so it kills me to see someone misinterpret data and think that some value proposition isn't a good one because they don't actually know how to reason properly with numbers. And one of the other things that we endemically have trouble with from folks writing proposals is that their figures, numbers, and tables don't explicitly tell a story. So if you see, you know, a lot of proposals will see something like this, and a reviewer is a little bit lazy. So with their first glance of this, they're going to say, okay, well, this product formulate has a different response rate than a control. But what you really want to do is add something that explicitly tells the reviewer what's happening. So in this case, adding a 25% faster response rate gives the reviewer something to walk away with, and then they don't have to interpret it themselves. And little things like this go a really long way in selling your proposal and your technology to the reviewers. And so to that, so as I remember, just as a reminder to what I said earlier, so now I'm going to present to you sort of 9 simple rules. I've modified them from a PLOS computational article on the best way to present numbers and figures. To be very specific for SBIR, STTR. And the first one is remember your audience. And we sort of already covered this, but do not assume they're proficient with your technology or topic. So when you present a figure about your technology, you really need to walk them through it explicitly. And every figure needs to be standalone. That includes the caption that goes with it, but that's pretty important. When you sit down to make a figure, you really want to start with the question of what do I want the reviewer to conclude from looking at this? Just like my example from before, the goal of that figure was to communicate a 25% faster response. So sit down with that, make a rough sketch of what the figure should be before deep diving into creating it. Each agency is a little bit different, but don't forget the medium of transmission. So if you can, figure out from your program manager how the reviewers will receive the information. So the figure on the left there is way more detail intensive, and that could be beneficial, but it requires magnification. So if reviewers are seeing it in print, which is you know, optional, for example, for NSF, reviewers may ask for it in print, then they won't be able to see any of that detail whatsoever. If you can present the same information but simplified for paper medium, like on the right, then that's going to be something beneficial. So don't forget that. So captions are extremely critical. A lot of figures, even with a label on it, have trouble standing alone. In this particular case, and also a lot of these phase 2 proposals are very space limited. So there's often this balance between making very expansive figures that take up a lot of space and trying to simplify. So this is a great example of a figure from a STTR, or sorry, an SBIR, where caption was really used. The use of color in the caption is extremely useful to the reader, and then the whole point of the figure is summarized in the first sentence of the figure caption. So already they know why they're reading it, and then they can dive into some of the details on the different shapes and dashed lines and colors and whatnot. Most of the figures we get are made in Microsoft products, and by default they're terrible because Microsoft defaults are by default terrible. It's going to take a lot of effort to make a good figure, so you want to spend your time doing so. So the same figure twice, one with the defaults and one without, and you can see there's a considerable difference in the quality of those two figures. For the most part, using color is beneficial to most figures. People like to look at figures with colors. Here, there's the same signal presented three ways, and you can see here that the proper use of color fundamentally changes the interpretation of the results. So in fact, the rightmost, the purple color map, is the best option. You can see exactly what you're supposed to be looking at, which is the frequency increases to the right and intensity increases towards the bottom. But that's very difficult to see in both the rainbow on the left and what they call a seismic color map in the middle. We also get a lot of things like this. I mean, this is an exaggeration, but the PLOS article coined the term chart junk. There's a lot of figures that are just filled with junk, and it makes it very difficult to read. Again, some of that is by the defaults and Microsoft, and some of it is laziness when it comes to actually fabricating these figures. So if you don't know what to do with the figure, try and look around for other ways similar data has been presented. This is a great example of how you can present 7 series of data. Each one gets overlapped on the other, so you can see the difference, but you get a clear picture of how each of the 7 series actually, what the data actually looked like. And then we're not all artists, that's fine, but remember that message trumps beauty. So make sure when you set out that you have a very clear message. This is an example of what I'd consider questionable aesthetics for an SBIR. It's hand drawn, but the message is very clear in terms of in terms of what this figure is trying to portray. And then my last piece of advice is to expand your arsenal of tools. Don't use Excel, PowerPoint, just Excel or PowerPoint or even LaTeX, if that's a tool that you're familiar with. There's quite a few free options available to you. If you can program in Python, Matplotlib is a plotting library. Similarly, there's a scripting language R for statistics that a lot of folks in the biology industry are familiar with, although it is entirely relevant to anyone doing statistical analysis, and it can make some pretty slick looking figures. Inkscape is a free version of what people are familiar with primarily as Adobe Illustrator. Very powerful tool for making all sorts of types of figures, and is pretty easy to pick up. GIMP is a free version of Photoshop. It is not as easy to pick up by a mile, but it is a pretty powerful tool for doing simple photo corrections and modifications. And in the article I quoted there's another larger list of tools, but those are the 4 that we recommend that folks get into. And so again, I'm not going to go through all of these again, but here's the summary of what we talked about. We cannot overstate how important figures and presenting numbers are. So just make sure you have your message and you try and follow the 9 rules that we presented.
I know it seems like we really talked about this a lot, but we do receive a lot of papers where they'll have 8 tables and figures, and we end up cutting 6 of them. I mean, first it takes a lot of space, but they're basically not conveying any information, and so we see this a lot. Or Jared might you've helped recreate some figures because they're just not clear. So it is something, again, very important and something that we see over and over again. That is an issue with companies we work with.
Yeah, it's just scientifically proven that the way people look at information when doing something like a review of a paper, figures are predominantly important. And so we hate to see someone not get funding. And so extra time spent on that is better spent than on other options, like rechecking your wording for the 30th time, which you'll do, but I'm just saying. If for any DoD folks out there, I just wanted to, I'll just be brief here. For DoD specific reviewers, as I mentioned earlier, they are more likely to be from national labs. They may actually be working directly on a project or topic which is benefiting from your phase 2 product. So for example, they might be working on missile visioning systems, and you may have a technology that is directly improving visioning. So they are, not only do they have a personal stake in the success of what you're doing, but their expertise area is going to far exceed that of traditional reviewers. And we see a lot of DoD projects submitted that are maybe a little bit naive. The problem with DoD in general is that a lot of the proposals are seeded. In other words, they already know what they want and they know who they want to do it. But because it's a federal program, they have to throw it out there for everyone to do. If you have a phase 1, you may have been a phase 1 recipient for a seeded proposal, which means you're going up against someone who they wanted to give a phase 2 to. That doesn't mean you won't get it, though. We actually know of quite a few companies who have beat out the incumbent in that situation. But you just want to make sure you're being extra diligent with discussing how your technology works. And the other big thing is that you really need to understand how Department of Defense works, their terminology, procurement, logistics, infrastructure. Using their language is extremely important to the success, because these people live and breathe this weird terminology that DoD has invented. And so if you talk in that terminology, it gives them confidence that you'll be able to operate in their environment. And then just my last quick point, DoD may or may not care whether your technology has civilian applications at all. If, for example, if you're making a targeting system for sniper rifle, they may not care. They may do enough business that you'll be a successful business just with DoD funding. On the other hand, if they do care, then you might want to pose an alternative for how that technology could be redeveloped for civilian applications. So in this case, I made up an example of ball tracking for live sports broadcasts.
So continuing under building a strong proposal, of course, your letters of support are very important and you need to use them wisely. Each agency has a different number. It's 3 or so. I think it might actually be 5 for NSF for the phase 2 proposal. You want to start early and give a false early deadline to your stakeholder that you're trying to get the letter from. These always are coming in last minute, so really get these out as early as possible. You ideally want at least one customer stakeholder. The letter should say more than "this is a great idea," and it should also come from people who might be involved in the testing, the business development, the technology development. You'll want to write them yourselves and send that draft to the person that's going to be reviewing it and signing it and potentially editing it. And you want to talk about their merit, the person that's signing on it, the stakeholder, your history of collaboration together, and how they are going to support you. And of course, we talked about how the phase 2 application is 50 pages, and we're not going to go into all of these, but we just wanted to bring them up just so they're in the back of your mind somewhere. Of course, you'll have your phase 1 technical report. So again, this differs across agencies. A lot of times, of course, you'll be submitting it before your phase 2, but sometimes it's also submitted as part of your phase 2. You'll have your project summary and abstract. You have your bio sketches. Those, if you have outside consultants, if you're working with the university, you're going to need to get them from all sorts of different people. So make sure you start on those early because you're depending upon other people to get them back to you. You got a page or two of facilities, equipment, and other resources. You might have a mentoring plan, and that's only specific to STTR if the sub-awardee, the university or research institute, has a postdoc. So that would be coming from the sub-awardee. There's other supplementary documents such as the payment schedule, a milestone chart, of course your references cited, data management plan, current and pending support, your cooperative research agreement, that's again with the STTR, again wanting to start early if you're working with the university. For NIH, your human subjects and vertebrate, and then consortium contractual cooperative research agreement, and that's for STTR. And this list can be longer, and so you'll just want to look at each FOA for each agency because there is a lot, and you'll want to make sure that you're aware of all that needs to be done, especially if you're depending upon other people to get some of these forms done.
Yeah, these guys do not make this easy. It borders on absurd how complicated the rules are. Like if you have agency rules, so for DoD, which is the worst case scenario, you have DoD rules, then you have your contingent specific rules. So say it's Air Force, then within Air Force there are different organizations which have separate rules, and then your proposal itself may have separate rules. And so there's so many things to do, and it's just important to keep a handle on all the components that you need to be worried about.
Yeah, I mean, organizationally, I'm sure a lot of you do this, but getting something set up in Excel of all the different things, all the different forms that you need to be, making sure moving along and the status of them, and internal due dates and things like that. Some common reasons for poor success of a phase 2 proposal, of course, not completing your phase 1 goals would be not good for phase 2 success. Not being prepared for financial audit, again, we're going to go into that a lot. Naivete in commercialization or business strategy. A research plan that does not lead you to commercialization or clinical trials. Insufficient mitigation strategies. So if you have certain risks for some of the research you're doing and you think you could run into a problem and you haven't talked about how you would deal with that problem. Your proposal scope, timeline, and budget don't mesh. And of course, just bad luck with reviewers, unfortunately.
That's definitely seems to be disproportionately the case for NIH, HHS, where reviewers are all over the board. It's unfortunate. In the National Science Foundation, with reviewers, there's a little bit more control. They're more handpicked, and the program manager has a sort of veto power. So if there's one reviewer who's off in left field, it doesn't affect the reviewers overall. It's sort of up to the program manager to interpret that. You can get bad luck with reviewers for DoD as well, where you just have someone who doesn't like what you're doing. So it's really tough if you just get unlucky. At least with NIH, HHS, you can reapply and hope that your reviewers the second time, who they will be different, will look more positively upon what you're proposing.
So we've gone over basically an intro and basics and kind of overall a lot of the different components and moving parts of phase 2, and just overall how to build a strong proposal. And so Session 2, we're going to be going over budget and audit. In session 3, we're going to be going over commercialization, but we're going to stop here and take any questions about, basics for phase 2, anything, building a strong proposal.
Don't save a question thinking that it may be something we talk about later, just in case. Throw it out now, and if it's not something, I'm happy to tell you. We'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah.
So don't hold back. You can post questions in the chat, or there's a questions interface as well. We have both of those open. And so we'll stop here for about 5 minutes, maybe, just to let people take a bio break. This is going to be a pretty long webinar, so give everyone a little break and to answer questions. Oh, we have a question. Sure, direct to phase 2. Yeah, direct to phase 2 the question is, could you talk more about direct to phase 2? This is an instrument that only NIH, HHS offers at the moment. Although all those things change cycle by cycle. NSF will never offer that, but DoD sometimes has specific topics that are sort of a direct to phase 2. In direct to phase 2, you skip over phase 1 because the sophistication of your technology is further along than would necessitate a phase 1. If the alternative to that is a fast track, which is a phase 1 and phase 2 at the same time. The benefit of a fast track is you get more money, but you also don't have the lead time between a phase 1 and a phase 2. So often you have about 6 months of downtime it takes for them to review your phase 2 and for you to get funding and the funding to get set up. And for a lot of smaller companies, especially in the biological spaces, if you're running experiments, it's a really long time to wait, especially if you have experiments that take a considerable amount of time. We generally recommend that companies do the fast track option. It's a drop more work than a direct to phase 2, but the success rate's about equivalent. But essentially during that direct to phase 2, you have to do the equivalent of a normal phase 2 application process, but you don't have any of the results of the phase 1 to lean on. You instead have to communicate prior results on your own. Direct to phase 2 is a good option for folks who've received other NIH, HHS funding, and so their technology is further along or their trials are further along. It's also particularly good if you need to jump right into clinical trials to do a direct to phase 2. That's generally clinical trials, as you can imagine, in the 6 months to a year you get during a phase 1 are pretty limited. So generally during a phase 1, most reviewers want to see some sort of animal model. If it takes more than that time period to get results, then again, if a direct to phase 2 may be beneficial. Yeah, definitely talk to the program manager before you consider that. It's something that you want to talk about.
Before sending it.
Yeah, before sending it in, especially since generally these phase 2 awards recently are going above the soft budgetary limit set by Congress, which requires you to get permission from your program manager to apply anyways. In other words, if your most of the budgets for phase 2s exceed, and forgive me, I forget off the top of my head, but I think it's 750,000 is the soft limit. So in other words, that's supposed to be the max phase 2 awards. Well, clearly, NIH, HHS, they're all above that amount. And so you have to talk to your program manager to receive a phase 2 award in excess of 750,000. It's, again, a process where for the most part, they don't care. They're going to tell you to go for it. And unless you really don't need that money, but that's pretty unusual. All right, I
Oh,
think,
wait, here we go.
oh, we
Another
got
question.
another question. The question is, do the program managers get involved in scientific review? They have the right to. It depends on the program manager. They all operate differently, especially NIH. They're given a lot of leeway. What they'll generally do is, if they think there's some fundamental issue with the underlying assumptions from their professional judgment, they may get involved. I think for the most part, they let the reviewers make that judgment, since generally the reviewers that they have brought in are going to have more direct experience with the topic area. For NSF, certainly the program managers are pretty actively involved. But again, from a scientific standpoint, they tend to default to those maybe in the know.
So budget, we're going to have, here's an overview of what the typical budget elements. Again, of course, these are different across different agencies. We're going to go over each one of these in more detail. Important budget note is that the FOA always takes precedent over the instruction manual. So if there's people who haven't applied to a phase 1 or anything yet, you know, there's the FOA for the agency, and then there's sort of a grander 200-page instruction manual that walks you through every step of the way. So, and the FOAs are always, they're changing every year. And so always look at the FOA over the instruction manual, and potentially anything we say. I mean, we update our presentations, but, and, you know, try to make sure they're up to date, but it could, you know, change in 3 months. So
additionally, what we say may contradict a very specific topic, and we can't clearly, with hundreds and hundreds of topics, target each individual one.
Right. Each agency has its own particular budget elements. They're similar across agencies, but they're slightly different and different rules. So again, always check the solicitation and guide. So review of budget elements, you're going to have, sorry, next slide, there we go. Your senior personnel, which you're going to want to calculate using person months, which is a little bit probably different than how you've calculated things before.
Yeah, you may or may not have done this during a phase 1, but you definitely need to do this going into a phase 2. All of your labor rates have to be justified using the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's unusual for a small business to get away with something different than traditional labor statistics data. Again, this is, we'll talk about this a little bit more during the audit again, but essentially they don't want you taking some exorbitant salary. It needs to be based on the mean or median in your area. And so generally the way you have to calculate person number of hours on a project is through the federal definition of a person month, which is 173.33 hours. And so if you were, for example, Dr. Jane Smith, and you were going to work 2 person months on a project, that would be your BLS mean wage. You would look up and find out that that's $48 an hour. You can even get more specific. It's probably $48.23. Then you're going to work for 2 months times the 173.33 hours per month, and that's the amount of salary you're asking for that particular person.
And there's different rules across agencies in terms of how many months you need to work on a phase 1 proposal or a phase 2 proposal. So for example, NSF, the PI has to be working at least 2 calendar months out of the year. That actually might be a phase 1.
Yeah, sorry,
that's actually a phase 1.
What that should have said is at least 2 calendar months per 6-month time period. Apologies for that.
Yeah.
So in other words, over a 2-year project, they have to work every 6 months, at least 2 calendar months.
Yeah. And then other personnel, so we've got senior personnel, and then other personnel must be employed at proposing companies. So other personnel does not include consultants. And then fringe benefits are likely not, you're not going to be including them here unless you have established accounting practices, which most startups don't have. So these would most likely are going to be included as part of indirect costs, which we'll go into more detail. Equipment is defined as an item of property that is more than $5,000 and has an expected service life of more than 1 year. If you're buying equipment, you generally must include at least 3 quotes for the equipment. The ownership.
Yeah, so this is pretty killer. Unless you're the National Science Foundation, ownership, the title to the equipment has to vest in the U.S. government. That means any equipment you buy during your phase 2, when the phase 2 is over, the government has the option to transfer that title back to you, in which case you get to keep it, or they may ask you to ship it at their expense to a national lab or some other government facility. If it's a general use tool like a microscope, they're probably going to take that back. If it's some sort of weird niche thing, they're probably not. But it's really hard to say. And sometimes the government takes ownership and then sells it, which is extra killer. So that's something you really want to keep in mind when you're spending your budget as much as possible. Unless it's National Science Foundation, again, under National Science Foundation, the title vests with you, so you get to keep everything you buy. Outside of NSF, you really want to make sure you're not spending a disproportionate amount of your budget on equipment that may be taken away later. It's just a risk. It's just a risk analysis you have to make.
Yeah, one of the ways that you can sort of ensure quoting equipment is if you break the equipment down into increments that are less than $5,000 so that you can categorize them as materials. Of course, you don't want to make it super obvious, but if it's something that can be broken down, then we recommend that you do that.
Yeah, if it's doable, you don't want it to be broken into separate invoices. That's not the same thing. But if you have like a microscope that's $4,900 and then you want to put this extra instrument on it and that extra instrument is $4,000, then buy them as separate line items. A lot of folks would combine them and classify it as equipment, which any reasonable person would, but we're trying to game the system here as much as possible so that it benefits you as much as possible.
And last point is that equipment should be US made when possible.
Yeah, if you can't buy a US equivalent, or you really need some feature that's from an international entity, then you have to provide a justification.
So travel, of course, must be directly attributable to the project. Sometimes people try to sneak in conferences, and that is not allowed, general scientific meetings. For each trip, your budget justification has to have a lot of details: the destination, the purpose, the number of days, the per diem. You want to use the GSA per diem rates for lodging, food, and incidentals. And travel, you'll always want to look at the FOA because it is always changing with grantee workshops and this kind of thing. Pretty much every year we see different numbers and different things offered. So right now for NSF, there's a phase 2 grantee workshop, which is you can charge $2,000 per person. For 3 people to go, you can get up to $6,000 total, and you don't need to have any justification for that. Phase 1 has had all sorts of different things that you have been able to include. So again, look at the FOA because it's always changing and they're adding different things. So participant support costs is not permitted for NSF or NIH, and this confuses people a lot because it seems like, especially for NIH, you might have some participants that are part of your study But here, participant, for whatever reason, is referring to those in connection with conference or training projects. So they're not allowed for SBIRs, STTRs. These participant support costs might be allowable for other NIH research grants, which is why it's included as a line item, because they use basically the same spreadsheets for everyone across NIH to be filling out. So materials and supplies, we talked about a little bit, but those are things that cost less than $5,000, and you need to justify with the quantity, the unit cost, and the total cost.
I just want to make a clarification there, because it feels a little bit erroneous to me. You can buy materials and supplies in excess of $5,000. The justification process is different. Again, it needs to be a competitive quoting process. So whenever possible, if you need to buy $10,000 of test tubes and they're each $1 a piece, make multiple line items for the different kinds of test tubes, or whatever you can to make as many of the line items less than $5,000 as you can.
Mm-hmm.
But if you need to buy a hunk of steel and that billet of steel is $7,000, there's nothing you can do about that. So you would have to go through a different justification process. So there is no restriction on the amount of money that can be spent on a particular line item. I just don't want anyone to walk away with that conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Publication costs and documentation costs for NSF, you need to discuss it ahead of time with your program manager. NIH, you're allowed to include costs of documenting, preparing, publishing findings of the work or products of the work that were conducted under the award.
Yeah, generally it's all limited to the award specifically, as it is a direct cost line item.
Right.
You may be able to include publication costs under indirect costs if it's not necessarily directly attributable, but that's a different, we'll talk about indirect costs later.
Consultant services are people working that are not employed by the company, and this cannot be greater than 33% of your budget. For NSF, you're going to need a letter of collaboration, and that has the rate, the cost, and the activities performed, and they will also need a biosketch from that person. And you should, again, check the rates that are allowable. So there might be a max daily rate, such as $600 a day or $1,000 a day. For NSF, it's the same as the phase 1 solicitation. So you have to go back for some reason and look at the phase 1 solicitation.
Yeah, the number changed. So depending upon which solicitation cycle you have your phase 1 out of, some of you may be 600 and some of you may be 1,000.
Mm-hmm. For NIH, again, you need to include details in your justification, and we just included there an example of what that justification would look like. Let's see, did we talk about how, I guess the percentage of STTR versus, no, maybe we talk about that later. Okay. The automatic data processing, ADP, or computer services, that is under NIH. I think for NSF, it's included under indirect costs. Subawards, that is, again, a STTR when a significant portion of the work is by another organization. Again, they will need their own separate budget and budget justification. And again, we provided just a written example there if you want to look back at that.
And again, just if you're doing an STTR, then and you have your phase 1, you already know the breakdown of what percentage can go to the sub-awardee. Remember that the university plus other sub-awardees has a budget restriction. So if you have other large sub-awards, just make sure you're following all the rules there. I've never seen anything like that happen, but it's just everyone has a unique situation.
Mm-hmm. NIH allows for equipment or facility rental or user fees.
Yeah, it's kind of a confusing line item. Equipment rental makes sense, but facility rental can be confusing because it would have to be directly attributable to the project. So you just want to make sure you follow those rules pretty
Right.
explicitly.
Otherwise, it's an indirect cost. Like it can't
Yeah,
be your general facility that you're using for other purposes.
like their examples would be like a clean room or hood space or something like that. In a larger laboratory setting, a facility doesn't include like an office, for example, and under that particular line item.
You surprisingly can have alterations and renovations such as repairs, painting, removal, or installations of partitions, air conditioning. This is only for NIH. And then there's various other ones that are under different agencies. For NSF, you can have routine analytical or other services. For NIH, you can have patient care and tuition remission. You can do the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. You can have, there's a technical assistance program under NIH, and you can do up to $50,000 across the 2 years for strategic business training and access to a network of industry experts.
There's all sorts of weird add-on options. So that's, that's a great example of one. And just a note, the patient care and tuition remission is probably the line item most people conflate with participant support costs.
Yeah.
So that's probably, if you have, say you're bringing people in for a sleep study and you want to give them a gift card or something, that might be where that line item falls. So one of the questions that's budget specific, and Jian, I'll get to your other question in a little bit later at the next question period. But the question was, how do we deal with the situation where we need a consultant, but it hasn't been identified yet, but we still need that consulting service. So it depends what the subject matter is of the consulting service. Generally, you can put in a substitutional line item. I would justify it using the BLS wage data as best that you can, and define what you want that consultant to do and what expertise level they should have, as though you were writing a job description. That can be, you can also do that to substitute for other personnel line items as well. So for example, if you need a lab tech, but you haven't sourced that lab tech yet, especially for other personnel, where they're not critical to the project, you can put in, again, use the BLS wage data and the projected number of hours, and just put in a job description for who you plan on hiring.
And you'll have to fill out a bio sketch too. So it'll just be, again, very generalized, like individual will have these skills and list that, or this education and list that.
Yeah, like undergraduate degree, 5 years of experience, however you might write a job posting. So, oh man, indirect costs, they're the worst. If you have a phase one, you've sort of started to jump into that. The best situation to be in, and if you likely recall from a phase one, is that indirect costs, you have the option of the safe rate for NSF and NIH. Now, to be clear, every agency calculates indirect costs differently, because why would the federal government all agree on how to do something? It's actually crazy and absurd that they don't have an agreement at all. And it's not even like a little bit different. Some of them are fundamentally calculated differently. So we'll talk about that in a second. For those of you who aren't yet that deep in the weeds, indirect costs are all costs that a company has, but they're not directly attributable to the project. That's the name indirect. So an office chair, computers, non-scientific staff, telephones, there's a whole list that we'll go through. One of the most important things going into a phase 2 is that your indirect cost rate be the same, ideally, or very similar to your phase 1. It can go up a little bit to, but if you say did 50% during phase 1 and now you want 82%, you will likely get in big trouble. You won't be able to pass the financial audit without a seriously good justification for that huge change. It's possible you may have changed facilities and your indirect cost is way larger, but it's very difficult to renegotiate a higher rate than your phase 1. Technically, leaving your phase 1, you probably did not actually formally negotiate an indirect cost rate with the federal government. You may have, but you may not have. It's not as though you get to do this once, but over the course of your phase 2, you are technically allowed to renegotiate, but we do not recommend attempting to do that. So make sure you have a nice, safe, or sorry, I shouldn't use the term safe. Make sure you have a reasonable rate that can follow you into the future. We almost always recommend taking the safe rate. It is entirely worthwhile to know that you won't be audited for your indirect cost rate. It is very difficult for startups to justify an indirect cost rate. And so we highly recommend you do that, even if that means you're taking a cut off of what you think your actual indirect cost rate is. In other words, you may actually have an indirect cost rate of 70%, but it's better to get your phase 2 than it is to get $0. So we highly recommend going with the lower indirect cost rate. That's a decision internally that you would all have to make. So as to how they're calculated differently, NSF calculates indirect cost rates as a base off of salaries and wages, not all direct costs. In other words, materials are not included in that. Whereas NIH uses a base of indirect costs is the total direct minus equipment and the other items. I'll put other in quotes here. There's a list, so you'd have to look at what the definition is. And then DoD has their own definition, which is pretty explicitly clear. So that's a plus because they deal with a lot of indirect costs with contractors. So you can look that one up as well. There is no safe rate for the other agencies. So you will, for DoD or DOE, NASA, whatever, you will have to have a complete justification. Essentially, what this entails is during the auditing period, you negotiate an indirect cost rate with your federal agency, and what that looks like is sort of different across the different agencies, but generally they have a division of financial advisory services, DFAS. They can have a division of cost allocation. In the case of NSF, they use external accounting firms. So the process is roughly the same, but the way each agency handles it is a little bit different. And then my favorite part of a phase 2 is the fee, which pretty much now everyone's sort of an agreement that 7% is the nice perfect number for that. You may not take more than 7% for any agency other than DOE, which I think allows up to 9 or 10, but I wouldn't recommend doing that. And most agencies, with the exception of DoD, if you take a really high number, they just accept it at face value. And a fee is just the equivalent of what would be your profit margin if this were some other sort of a project. During a phase 2, it is a huge chunk of change. So for a 750K project, which is probably the minimum project size, you're talking $49,000. Now remember, it's 7% of total indirect and direct project costs. So it's actually some like 6.52%, I think, or of the total project. And so your justification, you want to make sure even in going into phase 2, a lot of companies still sort of mess that up, thinking it's 7% of the total project cost. So our justification example is what we recommend you put in your proposal. As a standard industry practice, name of your company has taken a fee of roughly, and it's going to be some kooky number for rounding errors, 6.92% of the total direct plus indirect costs, calculated as, and then you have your line item there.
Yeah, if you didn't do it in phase one, you're trying really hard to get to that 150,000, and that fee percentage is where you want to change it so that you can get your exact number that you need.
Right. Yeah. So your fee is probably going to be where you change pennies to round to the exact dollar amount of your project, especially if you're doing one of the NIH phase twos where the total budget is that kooky number that even ends in individual cents. So you're definitely going to use that fee to make up any rounding errors. So one of the important things, I apologize for the formatting error here with the potential prohibited items, but there's each agency also has a different list of in items that you can include and items that are prohibited from the indirect cost. So, for example, a lot of the normal things that you would think, like facilities, utilities, insurance, office supplies, taxes, conference and travel, fringe this is where your fringe line item is going to go for 90% of you or more. Maintenance, equipment depreciation, your accountant can help you with all of these line items. It's up to you to communicate properly to your accountant what line items are prohibited by your agency to include in the indirect cost rate. So across the board, independent research and development is prohibited. Almost all the agencies restrict patent and patent-related expenses. You may not take those as a direct cost either. The federal government does not want to take money from its one pocket and put it in the other. In other words, from DoD and give it to the patent office. Legal varies significantly by agency, so you'll want to check that one out. But for the most part, no commercialization activities are allowable, even under indirect costs. Well, I should say explicit line items such as sales and marketing or business development. But again, it's all very agency specific. So make sure that you really understand what's prohibited. There is even some ambiguity in that. Even the agencies even admit they haven't created official rules on specific line items. When in doubt, talk to your program manager and see what he or she has to say, or just don't include it. It's probably not going to be enough money that it's worth it for you to take the risk and lose your phase two opportunity.
So some, in summary, tips for budget takeaway. Of course, take as close to the 7% fee as possible. You want to ask for your consultant letters of collaboration and quotes way ahead of time. And same with if you're having a subaward or STTR, you're working with the university, they tend to have a long turnaround time. So, if you had a phase one STTR, you might have already experienced that. Start way ahead of time. Use the maximum safe rate, or, well, in this case, use similar or close to whatever indirect cost rate you've used in phase one. Use the budget template to develop your budget. They have budget templates online, and definitely use these. We often have people sending stuff in, sometimes even Microsoft Word. And
if you work with us, we have templates that we would be sending you. But if that opportunity isn't presented to you, then you definitely use the resources the agencies have.
Triple check your equations, especially that fee, and making sure you're getting the percentage correctly off of, if it needs to include, doesn't include indirect costs, and get your accountant to help if you have any questions.
just a side note, if you are a DoD, the budget is an Excel spreadsheet that the federal government uses. It's kind of convoluted, so it requires learning a little bit how to navigate it. But essentially, it's by year, and then it aggregates certain line items, and there's a lot of equations embedded within it. So just make sure you familiarize yourself with it and you use that from the beginning.
We sometimes get questions like how much should I be included for personnel or equipment, and this is a common breakdown for phase 2. Of course, it can change depending on your company. Personnel is 20 to 30%, equipment is 20-30%, travel is very small, 1%, materials and supplies 20 to 40%, subawards and consultants 10 to 30, your indirect costs 13, and the fee is around 7%.
And keep in mind that this, these are, a lot of folks ask for this, so we made our general rule of thumb. But if you're a computer software company, you may not need any specific, you may not need any equipment as a line item, for example. It may be all software development. So you may be predominantly personnel. So take it for what it's worth, but this is where sort of the median for where most companies fall.
So the financial audit is probably one of the most important. Let's just make sure we have any, let's check. We're going to check on budget questions so we can address them now.
Yeah, let's just take another like 5-minute break, I think. We'll look for any questions being posted in chat or questions, and we'll try and answer those.
Yeah, we'll answer questions and we'll start back at 2:35.
So the question is an application transferred to a program manager after scientific review? So the program manager takes an active role during the review process. Again, it's agency specific and a little bit program manager specific. For the National Science Foundation, that looks like the program manager and all the reviewers sit down either in person or on a web call, and they discuss each proposal in detail, and then they write their individual reviews and an aggregate review. The program manager then adds his or her opinion to the aggregate review as well. For NIH, you have received very specific information from each reviewer, and again, there's some aggregate information. And generally, the process looks pretty similar, where the reviewers discuss together, but that may or may not happen. And that process sort of looks the same again across DOE and DoD as well, with the program manager taking greater or lesser roles, and generally with all the reviewers sitting down and discussing as a group. To that end, the program manager is not looking for all of the reviewers to come together and have one conclusive review. So the way that's handled is, for most of the agencies, the program manager in the end makes the final determination. For NIH, it's a scoring system you're probably familiar with if you're in the biological disciplines and you've dealt with other NIH grants. So that's a part of why NIH, you really suffer more from bad luck with the reviewers than other agencies. If you have one reviewer who just doesn't like what you're doing, even if everyone else was in agreement that what you're doing is awesome, it can hurt your score. And there's not a whole lot the program manager can do about that. There is some leeway in the program manager accepting things outside of a normal scoring range, but there's not a ton. All right, I'm just going to jump into the financial audit. So this part's pretty intense in terms of some details. I do believe this presentation is going to be posted, so you don't have to take copious notes on the specific numbers, but we want to give you some financial audit advice. We are not accountants, so we cannot answer any specific accounting questions or give you accounting advice. But we do understand how the financial auditing process works. And so we'll give you some insights into that so that you can prepare in advance. Because a little preparation actually could be the difference between you passing or failing a financial audit. And some of the numbers and things we give you are not necessarily publicly shared, and you may eventually find them out, but it may be too late for you to fix the underlying problems.
And again, the audit is one of the main reasons why people fail to get a phase 2.
Yeah, that the NSF program manager, the two that I work with, well, I work with like 3 or 4 now, but the two I worked with for the longest time, the one predicted that he was pretty sure 50% of phase 2s that NSF wanted to fund didn't get funded because they failed the financial audit. So when we say take it seriously, we're dead serious. Going into phase 2, you will be audited by an external auditing agency. I do not know of any exception to that rule ever. There's always an exception, but you must assume that you will be audited. The certainty of it is so clear that NSF is now allowing you to put direct phase 1 line items to pay even for your accountant to help you during the auditing situation. So it's pretty much a guaranteed, and so you want to be prepared. And the audit there's sort of 2 purposes to the audit. They want to make sure that you are responsible from a fiscal standpoint, and responsible enough to handle the government's money because they're giving you a lot of it. If you're doing your accounting in Excel or on a back of a napkin, they're not comfortable with giving you a huge check. And then the other pretty critical component to an audit is do you have the existing resources to handle the project budget you're proposing? So this could include cash flow to make requisite purchases, even if the money isn't in the bank. So different agencies award money in different ways. You may have to spend a lot of money out of pocket at the beginning of the phase 2, and you may have a cash flow issue until later in your phase 2. And do you have enough money to handle that? So again, first and foremost, we are not accountants, we are not lawyers, we cannot give you financial or legal advice. So take this for what it's worth. The most important thing to do that you can do anytime is to be a real company, financially speaking. So you want to make sure your bookkeeping practices are really good. If you don't already have an accountant, you should probably get one. And if you have a lot of purchases or bookkeeping makes your eyes glaze over, then you can also get a bookkeeper. Sometimes you can do that through your accounting firm. Having professional accounting software is pretty much a must. That means most people are buying QuickBooks. I can't advocate for QuickBooks. I happen to hate it, but it is a common package that a lot of accountants work with. You can talk with your accountant to figure out what works for your team and for your accountant's team. And you want to make sure your books look super clean and organized, and prepare as though you're going to be audited because you know you will be. You also need to have all sorts of things that you probably weren't maybe doing a great job of doing during your phase 1. You need to show timekeeping principles, so make timesheets, track overhead rates. And as I mentioned earlier, NSF lets you dip into your phase 1 budget to pay for some of this. So the audit has quite a few components to it. And I'll explain the justification for all of these as we go through. So they're going to want to see year-end financial statements for the 2 most recently completed fiscal years, which includes an income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow statement. And this is just looking at what your company's been up to. For a lot of phase 1 companies, it's pretty much just going to be your phase 1 money being shown on that. but it can be pretty telling as to whether you've properly used that money in those financial statements. You can provide interim financial statements. Sometimes they're optional. Sometimes you have to do them if your phase 2 is falling at the end of a year, but you wouldn't have a full year-end financial statement. So for example, if you're applying now-ish, you probably will be asked for a six-month interim financial statement. For a lot of companies, it may be beneficial to do this anyways, like a financial statement to date. So you can work with your accountant to see which puts you in a better financial position from an accountant's standpoint. They're going to want a capitalization table or a list of shareholders. This is, again, to make sure that you're complying with the rules of the SBIR program. If you are not, then do not apply for phase 2. If your shareholder agreements or your cap table contradicts the rules, you're in big trouble legally speaking. So definitely don't apply for phase 2, but I doubt any of you are in that situation. You also need to make sure that you're talk about your basis of accounting. If you don't know what that means, talk with your accountant. And you need to be using what's called GAAP, or generally accepted accounting principles. If you're doing anything different, then now's the time to fix your books. And then you're going to need other things like details of debt obligations, tax returns, if you've been audited by the IRS, which you probably haven't been. You're probably too small for the IRS to care. And then there's a slew of other information. So as for the other information, you want to make sure you include anything that would be beneficial to you. So details of additional investments, new contracts or grants, or expected contracts or grants, anything that shows that you plan to receive more money that would put you in a better financial position. So these are if you wanted to list why people don't get a phase 2 from an auditing standpoint, it's these 4 reasons. The 2 bold ones are most likely the reasons. So you are very unlikely to have a solvency issue, but you may. Again, if you're not 100% sure what that means, talk to an accountant, but it's generally indicated by a negative shareholder's equity on their latest balance sheet. So that would sort of only occur if a shareholder, if you have some sort of loan from the shareholders. But again, talk to an accountant. You probably don't have that issue, which is why it's not bold. Liquidity, however, is an issue most companies, small companies have. And there's a specific ratio that you need to meet. So a current ratio is the ratio of current assets to current liabilities. And not all the agencies tell you this, but you have to have a current ratio of less than 1 to 1. If you don't, you won't get your phase 2, or the accountant may, or the auditor, if you're close, the auditor may ask for a ton of additional information. And you need a quick ratio. The quick ratio is the ratio of quick assets to current liabilities. And that needs to be 0.9 to 1. So essentially what that's saying is you don't have enough money in the bank to actually pay to pay for project materials or equipment, because your assets are tied up in your current liabilities. And so to be clear, an example of that might be you have money coming in from the grant, but you have loans or rent that's going out. And if it's at a 1 to 1 ratio, you know, you're barely getting by. You're just able to pay all of your debts every month. A debt, it's a little more complicated than that, but that's my 2-second rough explanation. And a debt issue is the other one, which is indicated by a debt to asset ratio of less than 0.5 to 1. So share these numbers with your accountant and make sure that you are surpassing these. Otherwise, it's pretty much guaranteed you will not get your phase 2, which is why that rejection rate is so high. Generally, fixing this is just a matter of putting cash into the bank account of the startup, so that when you provide your bank statement to the auditor, it appears as though you have more assets than you actually would have had otherwise if you hadn't put that money in.
So sometimes people in phase one don't take their salaries to ensure that they have cash in the bank for phase two.
Right,
as an example.
or they don't take their fee. That fee is
Right.
left in the bank. So specific line items like that, for example. It is complex to not take your salaries during the phase one, but it is allowable. Pretty much every program manager I've talked to has said that hasn't historically been an issue. But the way that's presented to the auditor just needs to be pretty clear, because that may show up on the books as a liability, but you can essentially put the money in a separate. If you account for it in a separate way, it won't show up as a liability. So again, talk with your accountant. And then the last one, again, not highly unlikely for a small company to have unfunded loan maturities. So, but if you've taken a huge loan as a small business, the reason that you probably are not able to get a loan, a significant loan, but if you have, and it's coming term within the next 2 years, and you don't have any income, that's going to be another indicator of possible financial difficulty. If you have one of those, your burden during the audit really increases significantly. You have to put together a whole cash flow forecast, an operating budget. You pretty much have you're pretty much given a short opportunity. They may give you 1 or 2 days to put this together. You can have a short opportunity in which to make your case that you will be able to actually overcome the financial difficulty going into the phase two or during the phase two. Sometimes for companies that do get through this, it's because they have additional investments that are expected or that have been signed off but haven't received yet from shareholders or from investors or something like that. So any information you have to support that is something that you should put forward. So during your budget audit, these are all going to look familiar because it's essentially the same line items as the budget. But your senior personnel and other personnel that have had substantial salary, and to be clear, they don't define what that means. So use common sense. If you paid someone $1,000, it probably doesn't matter. But you need to provide a current payroll register for each employee, timekeeping records and principles and methodologies, an example time card for something like that. If you don't have someone who's presently employed but you plan on employing them, you have to have a signed employment agreement. Well, maybe not signed, but at least an employment agreement with the rate or pay to ensure that you can bring that person on. So they see that as pretty critically important. You want to bring in some expert who's not currently on your team, and you need to have agreed to a salary, right? That if that person falls off the team, can you actually complete the phase two work as proposed? And then, as I mentioned earlier, if you have positions that you haven't been able to fill yet, you need to provide as much information on how the rates were determined as possible. As I said, the best way to do that is to use the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, employment statistics. One of the things that hopefully you didn't do during the phase one, but is forgivable during a phase two if you change, if you change it, small business owner cannot be classified as a chief executive. I see people trying to do that all the time to take a really high salary rate. They generally don't want you to exceed the OES mean average salaries. I always tell people to use the mean or median. They're generally very close, and they don't really blink an eye if you use the median. So it's up to you which one you would choose, but I haven't seen that be an issue in the past. If you break the rules, so in other words, if you say, for example, that you're chief executive, what happens is they may not reject you outright for the proposal, but they will change your total budget amount. So they'll choose a standard occupational classification for you. So say you're a biologist and you chose chief executive, they'll choose whatever line item biologist that they feel best fits you. But remember, they're accountants; they have no idea about science at all. So you could be a clinician, you could be a computational expert, and so it could be the wrong occupational classification, and it could be pretty detrimental to your budget. In general, if you fail a component of the audit, but not the whole audit, they'll reduce your whole budget award and expect you to do the same amount of work. So it behooves you to make sure that you're not making any mistakes in advance, because that's just really killer to say, get $700,000 instead of $750 because of over a couple line items that they disagreed about. And there can't be a huge change in base salaries, or I should say a huge increase in base salaries from a phase 1 to phase 2. If there are, that's a big red flag. You can decrease salaries. That's why I said earlier, if you accidentally classified yourself incorrectly during phase 1, they may look the other way if you correct that during phase 2. Again, I doubt most of you will be dealing with fringe benefits. If you are, you've just, that's just a whole lot of work for you to do with respect to the audit, providing the categories of costs for the fringe benefits. And then you need to calculate the actual fringe rate for previously completed fiscal year. And one of the problems is that for small companies, your actual fringe rate may be different than your proposed fringe rate. Again, there can be penalties and annoyances associated with that. Just leave that to the larger companies and put your fringe within your indirect. So under equipment, that we always say that $5,000 threshold. You may elect to establish a lower capitalization threshold than 5,000, but I have no idea why anyone would want to do that within the SBIR phase 2 realm. That seems like a big mistake. So it is, if something your accountant has done, then you should talk about it with your accountant. If you have a situation where the equipment can only be provided by one person, then you have to do what's called a sole source justification. This is common in the federal government, and you need a quote from that source. Remember, again, your audience here is an accountant, not a scientist. So make it something digestible for them, that they understand why you have to buy from that sole source. And as I mentioned earlier, if a materials and supplies line item exceeds $5,000, they may ask for quotes and such. So just try and break it up as much as possible into smaller line items. Little things like that won't get you kicked, but it's just an annoyance, and you may have trouble doing it in the very short time period that they give you.
We've talked about consultant services already. There could be a restriction on the rate of pay, so make sure that you check what that is for you. And consultants should be chosen using a competitive selection process. Otherwise, you need to have a justification as to why you chose that one company or individual. Again, subawards will need their own budget and justification. It can be substantial work, but you can lose an award if your subawardee doesn't abide by the rules.
So yeah, as we said earlier, the NSF, NIH safe rates don't require justification. So if you budgeted indirect cost rates to an effective rate greater than 50%, they have to be substantiated. So that means putting together current indirect rate proposals. If you are any other agency like DoD, you're going to be doing that. That's putting together all your indirect costs and proving out, some of them are going to even be estimated going into next year. such like that, but work with your accountant to figure that part out. If you've been properly keeping your books, figuring that out only takes a couple seconds, but trying to justify a specific indirect cost rate for a small business can be tough, just in light of 1 month you might have a cost that you don't have the next. Whereas if you're a larger organization, you probably have some sort of, over the course of a year, you don't see as much variation. So you want to be able to show the most recent year expenses and you're going to want to show a reconciliation, which is an accounting term that has to do with bookkeeping. Again, all things that your accountant can help with. If you are doing it yourself, reconciliation is a tool set within all the budgeting and accounting software packages. Forward pricing is possible. It's really complicated, and I don't recommend you do it. And I think it's primarily there for larger DoD or companies that are working with the DoD who may have more complicated fiscal policies than most small companies. Remember, a small business is less than 500 employees, so a 450 employee company is going to be very different than most of the SBIR awardees, which is like 10 or less. And if the auditor does not approve of your indirect cost rate, you can lose your entire indirect cost, which is extremely punitive, or you can lose the entire award. And a lot of that is auditor dependent, so highly punitive. If it's a safe rate agency, it defaults to a safe rate, but the total award is reduced. So that may be a risk you're willing to take, but again, I wouldn't really want to get on the bad side of the auditor. So try and play that as safe as you can. And then of course, especially for indirect costs, each agency has completely different and complicated rules. So you really want to make sure you take your time and get the help that you need from experts. There's some other potential budget review items like subaward monitoring policies. If you're working with a subawardee, for DoD, that's actually very extensive. For other agencies, maybe not so much. You have to provide organizational governance for allowable costs. So that's going to be documentation you provide. As I mentioned earlier, all personnel expenses, the documentation associated with it, it's timekeeping records and principles. And they ask, there's some very specific questions they want answered. Like, do your records allow employees to report to multiple funding sources, which they should? Does the organization maintain records that reflect the total activity for which the employee is compensated? So for a lot of companies, that's actually a no, but you might want to make it a yes by changing your timekeeping principles. In other words, you work on the SBIR for 6 hours today, and the other 2 hours where you're answering random emails, they're not necessarily directly compensated. There's no project line item. So it's as easy as making a line item that's general administrative or something. And does the organization maintain a system of internal controls to ensure the personnel costs are accurate, allowable, and represents the actual work performed? That's a pretty big question. They want to make sure that you're actually doing everything kosher that you say you're doing. So the answer is to all of these questions. If it's a no right now, then make it a yes before your budget audit. And then you want to provide a brief description of the entity's methodology for documenting personal expenses incurred under federal awards. For a lot of accounting software, that's pretty straightforward. A classification system is all you might need to do for that, but it depends. And then you have to include subaward agreements and other operating, if you're an LLC, an operating agreement or other governance documents. And again, they're looking there to make sure that you're complying with the rules for the SBIR program. Sometimes governance documents can conflict. It's not likely, but it could happen. Oops.
So we'll stop there to take questions about the audit.
All right, folks. We know this has been long and we appreciate your patience. It's a lot of information. We got the one section left, the commercialization plan, and let's just dive right into that. So as we mentioned earlier, we sort of showed the stress by agency. National Science Foundation, it's almost exclusively what they care about. It's actually amazing to me, especially considering the S stands for science, how little after the phase 1 they stress the science and how much they phase commercialization. But that's why NSF is the small business friendly of the entities, or I should say small business friendliest of the entities. They provide the most resources and they're concerned with your success, and success will be tied to commercialization. As we said earlier, HHS, NIH, they don't really care a whole lot, even going into phase 2. And for the other agencies, you know, it is an impact, but it's not their most important. And again, for DoD, just a reminder from earlier, this commercialization plan may be within the DoD, or it may be within civilian markets, or both, depending upon your topic.
The requirements are different by agency, of course. NSF, it's 15 pages because, as Sharon just said, it is very important part of the proposal. Although NIH, HHS is 12 pages, and DoD kind of varies, 5 pages, no limit. It depends on the component and its agency specific.
So some of the common misconceptions that startups have, or at least convey during a phase 2 application, are the following. So the first is, I've done a market analysis and that's the equivalent of a commercialization plan. Those are very different. Knowing what the market wants and or what the market conditions are doesn't necessarily mean that the best option for you as a company is to make a commercialization plan around that. The second is a large market plus a value proposition means I'm a guaranteed going to be successful. It's the build it and they will come mentality. Unfortunately, that doesn't work ever. I wish it did. That would be great. Essentially, that shows a complete naivete, but that doesn't mean I haven't seen that quite a few times. Doing reviews, finish product development before pursuing the business development is something you see quite a bit. Those things really need to be concurrent, and you need to explain that they are. In other words, your customers and your business development should influence your product development. The research and development may be the same regardless, but some of the specific developmental steps might be different, or what the final product looks like might be different. So it's really something that you need to work on at the same time, and it's a big red flag. Believe it or not, people do not value good ideas. People value good business ideas, but those are very different. Sometimes really good ideas, sometimes the best ideas are not commercially viable because maybe they don't make sense financially. So again, that's a naivete that you don't want to convey. This one is probably another really bad one that's common, but which is that market analysis is the same thing as customer discovery. Understanding that a market is big or growing has very little, if anything, to do with what customers are actually looking for within that market space. I cannot understate the value of customer discovery, which is why all of the I-Corps programs and similar, and I should say a lot of national programs have now been based off of NSF's I-Corps program. They're all organized around customer discovery activities. It's just the most critical thing. And as we'll talk about, talking about customer discovery and commercialization is pretty critically important. And the last one, another naive position, is being better than competitors means success. One of the most important questions to ask yourself, which a lot of companies forget, is it's not just about competition, it's about other solutions. And one of the most valid solutions is doing nothing, right? So if they have something that doesn't work, they could switch to yours, or they could do nothing. What is the cost of them doing nothing, for example? So that's more nuanced, and it's going to be very specific to your product.
So we're going to go into detail about your commercialization plan and what components it should include. So we're going to talk about the problem, market need, the market, your target customer, the value proposition, the competition and alternative solutions, your commercialization strategy, the product development needs and obstacles, and the finances and revenue model.
So the problem and market need is really about telling your story how you tell it best. So that's going to be a section in your proposal. And what a lot of companies do incorrectly is they take explicitly the questions that are asked of them, and they really try and answer them in a serial order or something similar. Don't take the list of questions in all of the proposals instructions. You should really try and answer every single one of those questions, but do it in a way where you're telling your story best. The reviewers are not going to look at that subset of questions and be like, oh, they missed one, or they did them out of order. They're going to read this at face value. And one of the most important things is when you're starting off your commercialization section, do not worry about redundancy. That initial section that you're going to show where you're telling your story, it's going to have aspects of your commercialization plan, of your market research, of your customer discovery. Do not be concerned about a redundancy. You have 15 pages for a reason, and you're going to revisit all of those things. So treat it sort of like an abstract. You definitely want to talk about market size and growth rate, and that's probably evident to all of you, but one of the things that you'll want to make sure you properly convey is your TAM, SAM, and SOM. That's your total addressable market, serviceable available market, and your share of market. Those are different things. So the total addressable market is the portion of the entire market that you could serve for which your product is relevant, and we'll go over an example in a minute. TAM is going to be SAM is going to be a portion of TAM. So that's what you can do right now, what you can service now. One of the big things that people do wrong there is they sometimes think, well, I could do this later, but that's not part of your current SAM. It's okay for your SAM to change over time. And then your share of market is your percentage of SAM. So that's another thing that most folks mess up. And if you tell anyone a huge portion of share of market, they immediately do not believe you. There's almost no situation in which you can be 100% of a share of a market. Even in industries where one company is predominant, that rarely gets over 80%. So it's not reasonable for you to expect to ever make up a huge portion of share of market. And then you'll have a section where you do 3 to 5 year projections later on, where you'll be talking about sales and market share. So you may want to make sure you tie back in market share into that. So not just projections for sales, but also a projection for market share. And market trends are pretty important. A lot of times market trends can defend what you're doing. But that's more qualitative analysis that a lot of folks tend to gloss over. Market section can be pretty quantitative, and so people like that, but qualitative is a value as well. So here's my example for TAM, SAM, and SOM. So say you're the total market for alcoholic beverages is 72 billion in the US. your company is a brewery, you make beer, so your TAM is 21 billion because the rest of that market is for wine and alcohol, other alternatives. And then you only make IPAs and lagers right now, and you only distribute them on the East Coast because you're a small company. That means so your serviceable available market, your SAM, is going to be 2 billion, which is a very small portion of the 21 billion. That's because later, but remember, later you can expand into other regions and make other kinds of beers. But you're talking about what you plan to do now or in the immediate future. And then you want to justify maybe why you chose those. So those are the fastest growing beer segments. And you're staying on the East Coast because logistics and distribution efficiency makes sense for the coast. And then you'll want to make a prediction, like you predict that you can get a 1.2% share of the market in 5 years for a total of 24 million. So that's 1.2% of that $2 billion. So just an example. The target customer for you is it's always a very tough problem to describe, but it should be inspired by how you came up with your SAM and your general company focus. You want to describe the features of the customer and how you arrived at the target customer you did. Most SBIRs are business to business, and most target customer advice available to you on the internet is for business to consumer. So remember that those are very different. B2B or even business to government, which I'm not going to talk about here, if you're selling to DoD, is going to be very different as well. So for B2B target customers, you really want to talk about what challenges the business faces, what type of company are you marketing to? That includes the size of your target company, the number of employees it has, and by size, I mean revenue. An example is we focus on small businesses which do not have an accounting firm, or sorry, accounting teams. So say you're making accounting software, that might be why you do that specific focus. And you want to talk about, if possible, how many of such companies exist. So from our analysis, there's 10,000 such companies. That tells you how big, how many potential customers you have. And you also need to understand how procurement works for your industry. It varies wildly between different industries and even different segments of an industry. So you want to talk about what the job title is of the person who's authorized to purchase your products, and who do you need to sell to. So for example, if you're selling a microscope, it might be middle management, may be authorized to buy something like that. But if you need to buy, but if you're selling a robotic manufacturing cell, you may have to do a VP level. What that ends up meaning from a quantitative standpoint is things like lead times in terms of sales and other real life obstacles. And the goal of the commercialization section is to convey that you understand these. They care less that they exist. I mean, if they're insurmountable, that's a problem. But almost none of those things tends to be insurmountable. It's more, the restriction is more, does the small business properly understand these limitations, and will they be able, and understanding them is the first step in overcoming them.
Some of your target customer questions may include male or female, their age, where do they live? So is geography a limiting factor for any reason? What do they do for a living? How much money do they make? What other aspects, hobbies, habits of their lives matter?
And again, maybe you're not a business to consumer, maybe you're B2B, so just use whichever list is relevant to you. So if you're getting close to your phase 2, you're probably running out of time for customer discovery, because that takes a while, but you really want to do as much of that as you can, and you want to discuss a lot about it. During customer discovery, as much as possible, try to get letters of support or commitment from customers. Writing a proper letter of commitment seems, or getting a letter of commitment seems impossible to most startups, but it is entirely based on how the letter is written. I highly recommend working with local entrepreneurs incubators, whatever resources you have available to you through the SUNY system or locally, to help you write a proper letter of support or commitment. Sometimes you want as many firm commitments in there as possible, and the customer wants as few as possible. So it's really creating a balance where everyone is comfortable. Generally, those look like, if I accomplish these milestones, then the customer will buy X or Y. You want to use as many real examples and real discussions as possible. Remember that you're covered under non-disclosure for your phase 2. So you may want to be a little bit looser with actual customers you've talked to than maybe you would be in public. So an example, like when talking with GE, we discovered that their power turbine components currently require 400 hours of inspection, and they believe our technology can reduce that to less than 100 hours. So give very specific, tangible examples. Things like that are extremely beneficial, and reviewers take them as proof that you've actually done due diligence. So one of the things about value proposition that a lot of folks sort of gloss over is a value prop, at least from a B2B standpoint, is it really needs to solve a pain point. It needs to be a pain. I'm stealing this from somebody else, but the expression they used was, how is your solution a painkiller and not a Band-Aid? So people need a painkiller, they don't need a Band-Aid. So talk about what pain points you're solving, and when possible, hopefully you can do this quite a bit, you want to quantify the benefits that customers will receive. Don't use round numbers like 50% better, because nobody believes those. Try and make it an actual realistic value. So a 22% improved accuracy is a quantifiable benefit that a reviewer will believe. And then the more qualitative part often is differentiation from competition. So what really differentiates you from the current existing competition that is so fundamentally different that it makes you revolutionary, as opposed to just an evolutionary change or an incremental improvement? And then the best thing to do with the value prop is to organize it into as few main points as possible. 3 proposition is what is advised, but that's often not possible. But make it as organized and clear-cut as you can. Remember, this section is going to be 12 or 15 pages. There's going to be a lot of charts and market information and whatnot. When the reviewer leaves this section, there's a few things that they need to know, but they need to be able to say in a sentence or two what your value prop is. And this is your chance to really convey that to them. And if you can, explain how your value prop overlaps with your customer profile. So for example, some aerospace companies have shown primary interest in the automation aspect of our technology, and others have shown primary interest in the cycle time reduction. So you're in the same customer profile, but the value prop that they value the most may be different, and that's okay. You just need to communicate that. Again, it shows you're doing more due diligence.
For competition and alternative solutions, you want to discuss how your product or service compares to the competition or the current state of the art. You want to anticipate the competitive landscape when you get to the market. So look at current trends and project critical landscape changes. You definitely want to talk about your intellectual property landscape. How do existing patents limit you? How does your IP differentiate and protect you? And you want to discuss your freedom to operate. You want to be able to quantify, not just qualify, as much as possible. You want to discuss relationships, partnerships of competitors and potential customers. And when relevant, discuss the customer doing nothing, as we talked about before. You want to try to use you want to definitely use some competition graphics. They're helpful, but don't just make them generalized. They should be honest. So in this example, it's, you know, fast, low cost, automated, and it's a comparison chart, and it doesn't provide any useful information.
Well, one of the unbelievable things about it is that you're better in all possible ways, which is rarely the case.
Yeah. Something more specific, high precision, laser-based, adding more specific variables in there. And yeah, like Jaren said, comparing in an honest way. And of course, your competitor might have some kind of service that you don't have, or and you want to be honest about that. Otherwise, it won't be believable.
Remember, the reviewers will take about 5 minutes and look up your competitors, and sometimes within about 10 or 15 seconds they can find that you've misrepresented, and that's not a good place to be. Commercialization strategy, there's no particular commercialization strategy that they're looking for. That's something, but it needs to be defensible. So a lot of people ask, well, are they looking for an exit, or were they looking for this or that? It doesn't matter. Some examples include things like licensing or joint development, equity investment, sale of the technology or company, initial public offerings. Those are all very, very different pathways to go down, and they're all completely viable. You just need to convey that you figured out what works best for your technology. Believe it or not, I have to actually say that you need to convey to them what are you going to sell and when. People actually kind of leave that out. Sometimes it's ambiguous what you're going to sell. So it depends on what your company is, but make sure that's clear. If it's relevant, you need to talk about marketing, distribution, and service. If it's not, then you may not need to talk about that at all. Especially in certain spaces, it is pretty critical to have a strategic partner, and or you need to have a licensing or sale of technology as your strategy. So you want to talk about that and who the players would be. So for example, if you're making a drug and you want to license it, you need to talk about the major drug manufacturers and what that would sort of look like and what conversations you've had. For most companies, that includes a financing strategy. Do you plan on going the traditional route of angels, Series A, Series B, or are you going to do an equity strategy? Are you going to, can you bootstrap and take out bank loans? You need to talk about that kind of stuff. And if necessary, talk about your exit strategy. How are you gonna, are you planning on selling this? Is there an IPO? Again, they don't care what the answer is. They just need to know that you've thought about it. Another big one that folks sort of gloss over is product development needs and obstacles. And there's sort of three or four major obstacles. So first is research, of course. That's the one everyone focuses on. What are the requisite milestones to make this product ready? But depending upon agency, you may have accidentally glossed over development. How are you going to manufacture or distribute this? Even coming out of your phase 2, how are you going to scale this? Maybe phase 2 got you from 10 on a bench to 1,000 a year, but what if you need 10,000 or 100,000? What's your plan? And depending upon what area you're in, there may be regulatory restrictions as obstacles as well, especially in the biospace. That's a part of why NIH de-emphasizes commercialization, because they know most of their companies are going to have so many regulatory hurdles coming out of the phase 2 that the commercialization strategy sort of looks the same for all those companies. And there might be market development restrictions, or so it might be some market obstacles as well. What is the product appetite? What does market growth look like? What market dependencies are there? So for example, this other thing is hitting the market in the next year or two, and we can't sell before that hits the market. So those can happen. This is a little out of place, but it is related to product development and is critically important if you're doing DOE. You need to define your technology readiness level now and at the end of your phase 2. And you need to be very clear that you've given the correct answer to that question. DoD is expecting a certain TRL. It can be solicitation specific. So you want to be very clear that you're conveying that you're meeting that at the end of your phase 2. And if you don't explicitly state it, you could get yourself in some trouble. And then one of the last sections here is finances and revenue model. This people pretty much do okay on. You want to do a pricing and margin analysis. How much is a customer willing to pay is really going to come from your customer discovery activities. So again, the more of those you do, the better. You really want to talk about assumptions when you're doing any sort of finance and revenue modeling. So make sure that you talk about that as much as you can. Generally, there's a boatload of assumptions that go in, but try and talk about the major ones. You want to describe an appropriately staged finance plan. So break it up into specific milestones. These are commercialization and development milestones. And talk about how much money you think you need for each of those stages. You're probably going to be wrong. Most people ask for roughly half of what they end up needing, but it shows that you're giving it forethought. You want to describe the revenue streams, and then you want to anticipate the first revenues from each of those streams. A lot of companies only have one revenue stream. That's fine. You have a product sale or licensing or something. Just talk about that in more detail. And one of the big things that all of these agencies want to know is when you can break even. Again, you're going to show an annual pro forma. That's going to be essentially a forecast of what you are going to look like over the next 5 years. And you'll want to convey your break even. If you don't break even within that time period, you want to convey when you think that's going to occur. And break even is when your profit for the year is $0, essentially, right? When you bring in enough revenue to sustain the company.
There's various places that you can get support for developing your commercialization plan. So you could use granting agency resources. Often in phase 1, they're, depending on the agency, they have allowable funds to help you with some of this. SBDC or other SUNY university or local incubator resources. Find a business mentor you trust and someone who has a lot of relevant industry experience. But be cautious of those who have spent a lot of time in another industry, because it can be very different advice. Be careful of using online resources that are focused on B2C commercialization strategies. You want something more focused than that. And as I guess I already said, use the phase 1 resources for market research. So for example, Dawnbreaker or the commercialization assistance by the other agencies. So that concludes the phase 2 presentation. In terms of working with our company, Amala Consulting, there are some funds available through this program, and I'm sure Liam will be following up in a separate email about that. Or you can contact us for a direct contract. We have a variety of services such as editing, technical assistance, budget review, and the hours really range depending upon the services requested. So thank you everyone for sticking with us and being here today. I know that phase 2 proposal is pretty overwhelming, so I hope that we provided you with some good information, albeit a lot of information.
One of the questions was, do you have similar slides for phase 1? And yes, we do give a phase 1 presentation that's very different than this. It's a little bit broader and easier to digest.
It's a lot more general.
There are a lot of opportunities to hear that presentation. So if you can follow up with Liam, maybe we can find a time for any of you who are doing phase one work as well to maybe do that presentation as well.
All right, we don't see any more questions, so we are going to sign off, and I'm sure you'll get a follow-up email from Liam. So thank you again all for joining us today, and good luck on your proposals.